Hello and welcome to another episode of Theater House Profiles, in which I document theater houses, their histories, and whatever random fun facts I can find about them. Today we're going to be looking at something a little more intimate. And by intimate, I mean smaller and more humble and not as big budget or spectacular. Now you get the picture. Yep, today we're going to be sneaking a peek at the Hayes Theater, previously known as the Helen Hayes and the Little Theater, the smallest theater on Broadway, owned by Second Stage Theater and located at 240 West 44th Street with only 597 seats. The Hayes is known for its small size and humble history, and when it wasn't housing plays, it was a TV and radio studio. The purpose of this little theater was to introduce new playwrights to the world, as well as present anything that was new and experimental at the time. And we have Winthrop Ames to thank for that. Our story begins in 1912. The New England native came up with the idea of the theater so he could give smaller, more intimate, non-commercial productions a chance on Broadway, because back then, there wasn't an off-Broadway option. In his own words, his policy was to produce the clever, the unusual drama that had a chance of becoming a library classic. Thus, the Little Theater was born, designed by Harry Creighton Ingalls and F.B. Hoffman Jr. When it was first built, it had only 299 seats and no balcony or boxes, during a time when Broadway houses usually had around 800 seats. It was built with a colonial theme to it, complete with red bricks, white pillars, and even a working fireplace in the lobby. A perfect theme for what Ames was going for. Also, the seats were built on an incline that helped the audience have an unobstructed view of the stage. The theater officially opened March 12, 1912, with John Gladsworthy's The Pigeon. The same year, we had The Terrible Meek by Charles Rand Kennedy, The Flower of the Palace of Han, also by Kennedy, as well as Louis Lely, a revival of The Affairs of Anatole by Arthur Schnitzler, an adaptation of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs by Jesse Graham White, and Rutherford and Son by K.G. Sowerby. Throughout its years, it would continue to be a home for smaller name and avant-garde shows. Sure, this theater was good news for up-and-coming playwrights at the time, but the same couldn't be said for Ames. By 1915, a mere 3 years after the theater opened, Ames was already starting to have money problems with his little theater. Even with sold-out shows, the theater wasn't making enough money due to the small seating capacity. He could barely even support stars like John Barrymore with what he was making. He was soon in danger of losing his house. The fact that he was financing all the shows himself also wasn't helping at all. Ames had no choice but to expand the theater. Ames had plans to expand the seating capacity to 1,000 and add a balcony, while the balcony was added. The 1,000-seating plan never came through, because the cost to add that many seats would have been the same amount of how much ticket sales he was losing. In 1920, the remodeling was finally finished. The Little Theater now had a seating capacity of 450. Right before the renovations, the Little Theater was host to its first long runner, A Little Journey by Rachel Crothers. Soon, Ames was leasing the theater to producers like John Golden and Oliver Morosco. Don't worry, everyone. The Little didn't lose its original purpose with these renovations. After the renovations, the Little Theater's purpose to bring spotlight to smaller name shows reflected afterwards with these next two shows it housed. Mama's Affair, a Harvard student's writing debut that won her a cash prize from her alma mater in January 1920, followed by Eugene O'Neill's Beyond the Horizon, his first full-length play. Beyond the Horizon was previously playing matinees at other theaters before finally settling with The Little, and it even won the Pulitzer Prize. While Ames still owned The Little, this time around, John Golden, F. Ray Comstock, and L. Lawrence Weber were leasing the space, with Weber also managing. Unfortunately, by this time, Ames' family fortune just kept on suffering. Even with all the successful shows The Little was being host to, by 1922, Ames had lost $504,372 on The Little. 2 years later, in 1924,
Pigs, a play about a spectator who bought 50 pigs, cured them of their sick health, and sold them for a great big profit, turned out to be one of the best plays on the Great White Way that year, produced by John Golden. Circa 1926, the theater's first revue show was performed there. Relocating from the neighborhood playhouse was the Grand Street Follies, a revue that poked fun at the plays and players of the season. In late 1930, Ames had had his last involvement with the Little. It was a production of his own play, Mr. Samuel, playing for only 8 performances, starring Edward G. Robinson. The following year, Ames had departed from the theater business altogether. Starting in February 1935, CBS used the theater as the CBS Radio Playhouse, only for it to become a legitimate theater once again on September 28, 1936. During this time, a bunch of plays with honeymoon in their titles found their home at the theater. Honeymoon, One More Honeymoon, and Pre-Honeymoon. The first 2 had short runs, but the last was successful enough to move here from another theater. Pre-Honeymoon was written by Alfred Van Ronkel and Ann Nichols, and Ann Nichols ended up getting the honor of having the theater renamed Ann Nichols Little Theater. In 1937, Ames died, and his wife was forced to move from a huge mansion to a small cottage on their estate, for at that time it was only worth $77,000. Meanwhile, at the Little, Cordelia Otis Skinner opens her one-woman show, Edna His Wife, and the house goes back to just being called the Little, followed by another revue show.
Now we come to the Little's TV studio days.
From the 40s to the 50s, the Little was not used as a Broadway theater. First, it was a conference hall, then it was a TV studio. In January 1942, the building was sold to the New York Times, for at the time, it was located adjacent to the headquarters of the New York Times and renamed the New York Times Hall from 1942 to 1959. During this time, it was used as a conference hall with an occasional concert. In 1959, ABC converted it into a television studio. In 1963, it once again became a live theater with the gospel musical Tambourines to Glory by Langston Hughes and Job Huntley. In 1964, after a short-lived actors studio production, Baby Wanna Kiss, the theater was renamed the Winthrop Ames, only for the name to go back to just the Little the following year once again. Late 1964, while it was still the Winthrop Ames, it was once again converted into a TV studio and leased to the Westinghouse Broadcasting, where it hosted the David Frost and Merv Griffin TV shows. It continued to be a TV studio from then until 1974. That year, the Little housed My Sister by Ray Aranja.
Hey, ready for a long-runner story? You got one.
June 1977 was when the Little Theater would get its longest-running show ever. Gemini by Albert Inarado moved in, and it was the very exact portrait of what Winthrop Ames originally wanted for the Little Theater. Gemini ran for a whopping 1,788 performances, and is the 4th longest-running straight play in Broadway history. Soon, the Little was given special status by Actors Equity and other unions to have profitable runs in spite of its small auditorium. Thanks, Equity! In 1979, the Little Theater was purchased from Westinghouse by the Little Theater Group for $800,000, consisting of Martin Markinson and Donald Tick, with Ashton Springer serving as managing director. In 1981, the group spent a few dollars to have the Little restored. Its interior was redesigned by ACDA Design.
While the first 3 shows after the renovations flopped, this next one proved to be a success.
In June of 1982, the Little had another ideal play performed there, the Torch Song Trilogy, written by and starring Harvey Fierstein. This trio won the 1983 Tony for Best Play, and Fierstein won for Best Actor in a Play. In July of 1983, the Little Theater was renamed the Helen Hayes Theater after the tragic demolition of the theater that previously held the name. That will be safe for another episode, don't you guys worry. On November 17, 1987, the interior and exterior of the theater was given landmark status. Soon, Markinson and Tick had plans to sell the theater at an auction on March 24, 1988, with a $5 million minimum value put on the theater, and refused to sell the theater to the Nederlanders or the Schuberts. The theater was never sold, for the auction was a failure. Torch Song was followed by a few more smaller productions. A notable one is Mummenschanz, or The New Show, which was a new edition of a popular mime show. Then, after that, we've got two one-act musicals that moved here after off-Broadway runs. Those were Mandy Patinkin in Concert, Dress Casual, and Artist Ascending a Staircase. Defending the Cavemen is another notable long runner there. It was a comic monologue about the differences between men and women. It ran for 671 performances, which was a record for a non-musical solo show. In 1997, the Hayes hosted another Tony winner, The Last Night of Ballyhoo, by Alfred Orry. It starred Paul Rudd and Dana Ivey, and it centered on a Jewish family during the 1939 premiere of Gone with the Wind in Atlanta. It won the Tony for Best Play, and Dana Ivey and Terry Beaver took home Tonys as well for their performances.
And now, here's a tidbit for Andrew Lloyd Webber fans. Like myself.
In the 1970s, Andrew and British playwright Alan Ayckbourn collaborated together on Jeeves, based on the stories by P.G. Wodehouse about a bumbling aristocrat named Bertie Wooster and his infinitely competent butler Jeeves. While the show was a flop when it was originally performed, the writers returned to it in 1990, hoping to get it just right. The end product was By Jeeves, a scaled-down version of the story, which had a modest run in London. It opened at the Hayes on October 18, 2001, just after the 9/11 attacks. Lloyd Webber himself attended box office opening day to greet ticket buyers and congratulate New York on being strong during a difficult time. But even with this generous gesture, it wasn't enough to keep the overly British show running, for audiences found it to be too twee and self-satisfied with its humor. The show lasted 73 performances, and to this day, it remains the composer's shortest Broadway run to date. On April 27, 2006, Donald Tick, one of the key figures of the Little Theater Group, passed away. His name continued to appear as principal of the Little Theater Group. The following year, on July 10, 2007, the Hayes housed the sleeper hit known as Xanadu, a musical based on a disco-era flop film of the same name about a man whose dream is to open a roller disco. Playbill.com states that the show received great reviews from critics who couldn't believe how much they liked it, and it ended up lasting for 512 performances. In 2008, the 30th anniversary of the Little Theater Group was fast approaching. In July of that year, Markinson and Tick's family announced that they were selling ownership of the Hayes to Broadway's Second Stage Theater Company, who want to have their own pied-à-terre theater on Broadway. During this time, the Hayes house shows such as Slava Snow Show by Slava Polanin, The 39 Steps, and Rock of Ages. The sale was completed by 2015 for a total of $24.7 million. The now renamed and renovated Hayes had its first second stage production earlier this year, Lobby Hero, starring Michael Cera and Chris Evans.
And with that, we are out of time. Until next time, everyone, so long.